All right, we're recording now. Go ahead and type in the chat box. If you've typed before, type again, just to be sure, okay? And let me send this. All right, now we're ready. Okay, well, today we're going to cover life history traits, and this is the last material that's going to appear on the first exam on Monday. I'll have a little to say about the exam at the end of this presentation, okay, and how it would be useful to study for it. And I'll tell you what I can about the structure that I'm anticipating that we'll try to make it an equal thing for those of you who have to take it on Moodle and those of you who can come in to take it. So, this is a set of adaptations that is common to all organisms. And it's kind of a different view of adaptation because it's not adaptation to a particular environment in the same sense that, say, heat conservation is for organisms in cold environments, or mechanisms for salt tolerance are for those organisms who live in saline environments. It's more of a schedule of how you allocate energy to growth, survival, and reproduction. And we call those patterns life history patterns. So we call these traits life history traits. However, they are coded in the genes, and basically it's kind of a series of switches. Each organism is adapted to a particular kind of environment that makes it advantageous to, say, grow relatively quickly and reproduce fast, and then stop growing and put all your energy into reproduction, because you might not survive all that long. Or, the opposite extreme is organisms might be adapted to environments in which it pays off to just grow and grow and grow and be a really strong competitor. But in order to do that, you can't reproduce early. You have to save reproduction till later in life. So these schedules of growth, survival, and reproduction are what we call life history strategies. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and we'll get started on this. And I hope people who join late will remember that they have to type something in the chat box. But like I said, at the end of the presentation, we'll tell you a little bit about what I anticipate for the exam. So I'm going to share the screen here, and hopefully my slides are not so full today that they will be cut off the way they were kind of last time. I was a little surprised at that, but hopefully we'll be able to see the bottom row. So let's oh, come on, there. And I see I've got to stop typing on that bottom row because it's going to cut a few things off, but I'll try to make sure that you see it. And you can look up the PowerPoint, which will have all the text regardless of where it is on the slide, if you miss something and you're not sure what it was. So life histories. First, we'll talk about what the genetically coded life history traits actually are and why they are all related. You can't change one without changing every other one. And that's kind of a weird thing. And it's hard for people to keep track of which traits change in what direction when you select on one. So you have to pay close attention to that. And sometimes it goes the opposite way than you might expect, just looking at it naively. So you got to sort of really think it through and pay attention. Okay. After we do that, we'll look at three key trade-offs in life histories that affect every organism. Growth versus survival versus reproduction, and how you allocate your energy. Then we'll look at a couple of kind of archetypal strategies called semal parity and iteroparity, and we'll talk about the conditions that favor one or the other. And then we'll look at how ecologists kind of think about these strategies, because they do think about them and try to classify them in ways where you can just say, this life history strategy is X. And it kind of means something to everybody who's talking about it. And that's going to be useful to us because we're going to use that classification more than once going forward in the course. And so it'll be useful for you to have a kind of feeling for this life history strategy is characterized by X, Y, and Z in these traits. And this other one is characterized by A, B, and C in these traits, so that you can quickly switch your thinking back and forth as we go. So what's a life history trait? A life history trait is a characteristic of an organism that is related to schedules of growth, survival, and reproduction. And there are genetically coded switches that shunt energy into growth or survival or reproduction at different times in the life cycle. These are really important in ecology because they integrate the overall responses of an organism to its environment. So an organism may have adaptations to the physical environment or to escape predators. And the bottom line is that those organisms can expect to survive, they can expect to grow, and they can expect to have opportunities to reproduce based on the sum total of all their adaptive traits. But the common currency that they're working with is energy. And so life history traits determine how you allocate the available energy between growth, survival, and reproduction. And it's really important to understand these traits because they require trade-offs. You cannot simultaneously allocate energy to growth and survival. It can go to one or it can go to the other, but it can't go both places. A single packet of energy must have a single destination. If you decide you're going to grow a lot, you cannot simultaneously develop adaptations for survival, and you can't reproduce to the same extent that you would if you were not growing as fast or not using as much energy for growth. But that's the principle of allocation. Energy devoted to one use cannot be devoted to another. So the key life history traits then that we focus on are body size, which is genetically coded, longevity, the average lifespan. You know that organisms senesce and die. As much as you might want to live to 240, that's not going to happen. On the other hand, sea turtles probably do live that long, and that's genetically coded based on their allocation patterns, their patterns of energy allocation. The growth rate, do you grow quickly or do you grow slowly? When do you start devoting energy to reproduction? So the age at first reproduction, that's a really key life history trait. Others are parity, which is the number of reproductive events. Some organisms have a single reproductive event in their entire life. Others have many. Clutch size, the number of offspring per reproductive event. Humans are generally about 1 for clutch size. Lots of birds are 7 or 8, and salmon are 10,000, 20,000. clutch size. And there are trade-offs involved there too, because you can't simultaneously have big offspring and lots of them. And that's the last one, which is parental investment, which is the amount of resource that you devote to each offspring. So how big is it? But I think you can already see that if you have big offspring, you can't have a lot of them. And you may not be able to have them often during your lifetime. You might have to save up. On the other hand, if you have minimal investment in each offspring, hey, you can have huge numbers of offspring, and you can do it often. So there is a quick preview of the things that we're going to talk about. The key concept here is the principle of allocation. If you change one, if you devote more energy to growing a larger body, you must change all of the other traits because they are all correlated. Changing one changes everyone. And so we'll have to keep track of how that works. So let's look at three key trade-offs to illustrate how this works. The first trade-off is growth versus reproduction. If you decide to reproduce, then the energy that goes into your reproduction to produce new offspring cannot be used to grow. And so here is a little graph that shows reproduction or the growth rate of reproducing or non-reproducing barnacles. Here are the reproducing barnacles. They are paired because they're sexually reproducing. And so the assumption of this study is if they're in a pair, then they must be devoting energy to reproduction. And look, they do not grow as fast as individual barnacles that do not have the opportunity to sexually reproduce. Now, this is not simply isolation. This is a choice. Barnacles can choose to associate with the barnacle next to them and sexually reproduce, or they can have a barnacle next to them and just choose not to. And so these non-reproducing barnacles are not simply isolated. They are choosing not to pair up with their neighbor. And as a result, the energy that they have available goes into growth. The ones that do choose to pair up are putting energy into reproduction, and they grow slower. They grow to a smaller size. So this is a really good example of the principle of allocation. These guys are choosing to shunt energy into reproduction. That means they can't grow. These guys are choosing to shunt energy into growth. The only way they can do that is not reproduce. So here's a second trade-off: reproduction versus survival. All right, so investing more energy in reproduction reduces your probability of survival. If you have a fixed energy budget, it then selects for some optimal allocation of energy among your offspring. So let's see how investing in reproductive effort, just dumping energy into reproduction, affects your survival first. That is given by the graph here on the left. So what we've got here is nesting pairs of kestrels. These are often called sparrowhawks. And what we're going to do is compare the natural reproduction of kestrel pairs to what happens if we take some of their eggs away so that they're not investing in reproduction as heavily, or add eggs to their nests so that they have to invest more in reproduction. Now, here is the typical investment pattern of a pair of kestrels. Normally, a female kestrel will lay about 5 eggs. And as a result, the male and female kestrel have to feed those chicks. So, oh boy, actually making eggs for a female and making sperm for a male is only a very small part of the parental investment that they make. they are consumed with daily feeding of those chicks for probably 6 weeks, and they can do nothing else. They can barely find time to feed themselves. As a result, when they are done with nesting, a lot of them are in very poor condition and they don't survive to the next year. So females that have a clutch of 5 chicks survive to the following year at a rate of about 45%. Notice that males that help raise a clutch have a somewhat higher survival rate, a little over 60%. But still, what this indicates that, hey, there's a cost to reproduction. Like investment in reproduction means that you can't devote that energy to things that you would normally do to survive, like make sure that you get enough food, make sure that you don't exhaust your energy supplies. Now, what happens if we take 2 eggs out of that nest so that the males and females are not trying to rear 5 chicks, they're only trying to rear 3? Well, in that case, the effort that they have to put out to feed those chicks is much smaller. And so look, females survive at a higher rate, over 50% compared to 45%, because there's less stress on them. Males also survive at a higher rate, about 70% versus a little over 60%. And so the energy that they would have put into rearing extra offspring, they can now use to ensure their survival to the following year. If we take those eggs out of a nest and put it into a different nest, then we're adding to the burden of that nesting pair, and they have to expend way more energy trying to rear those chicks. So in this case, if females and males are trying to successfully rear 7 offspring, first off, notice that they really don't make that. They only get about 6. And notice that the extra effort that the females have to put in drops their survival to the next year from about 45% down to about 35%. So it's clear that allocation of energy to your offspring decreases your survival. It also decreases the survival of males because their survival is now less than 50% compared to over 60%. So it's a trade-off. If you invest more energy in reproduction, you're likely to not be able to invest in survival, and you're likely to survive at a lower rate. Investing less in reproduction means that you can invest more in survival. So it's a trade-off. And what organisms are selected to do is to find the optimal allocation pattern. What's the best use of energy in this environment? Is it worth it to invest heavily in reproduction, even though I might not survive? Or is it worth it to invest less in reproduction so that I can survive at a higher rate? What determines those patterns, the selective pressure that determines those patterns, is the lifetime reproduction of the individual. So over the course of a male kestrel's lifetime, does it produce more chicks over its entire life if it produces low numbers of chicks but survives to have many nests? Or does it have a higher fitness if it produces lots of chicks and has a very low probability of having a second nest? Well, this is the pattern that normally we see. So it's kind of intermediate here in the extremes to what we've done. But when we see these patterns, we start from the idea that they are selected as optimal patterns that maximize the lifetime reproduction of the individuals. Now, a second issue here is exactly how you allocate your energy among offspring. And you can see that there's a cost to having too many offspring, and there's a risk in having too few. If you have too few and you don't survive, well, you lose out. If you have too many, well, you may not survive. So there is an optimal clutch size for most organisms. And what you can see here is if you look at the pattern of nesting in magpies, you can see that most magpie nests produce about 7 eggs, and about half of those are fledged. They become fully independent offspring. The other half die. If you have fewer than that, well, duh, you should expect to have fewer surviving offspring, and you do. If you only have 6 eggs, you only have 3 offspring on average. If you have 5 eggs, you only have a little over 2 offspring on average. But the cool thing is that if you have more than 7 eggs, you also have fewer offspring survive. And that's because the extra work required to feed them means that not all of these offspring get enough food, and so they die. So, hey, there's an optimal schedule of number of offspring. And both of these graphs bear on that point. If you have a certain amount of energy to devote to reproduction, there's going to be an optimal number of offspring. The third trade-off is current versus future reproduction. And this is where age of first reproduction comes in. If you start reproducing at a young age, then you don't have time to grow large. And that means that you're never going to be able to accumulate as much energy for reproduction in the future as a larger organism would. But the only way the larger organism can do that is to delay reproduction. So here's a little sample table. This is just a hypothetical thing. And what it's illustrating is that delaying reproduction can result in higher fitness if you can expect to live a fairly long time. If you live a short time, there may be no net benefit in delaying reproduction. You might be better off reproducing right now. So let's examine how this table works. So what we're assuming here is that you got an organism that can start reproducing at any of these ages, 1 through 6. But the catch is that if you start reproducing at a young age, you stay the same size forever. And so you can only produce the same number of eggs that you started with. So if you start reproducing at 1 year of age and you can only produce 10 eggs, then you're stuck at that body size. And you can only produce 10 eggs a year. So over your life, you can produce 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 after 5 years. And the question then is, well, how long can you expect to live? If you can expect to live 8 years, notice that delaying reproduction for a year or two results in much higher fitness than if you started reproducing immediately. So in fact, this would be a stupid strategy. If you could expect to live 8 years, then starting to reproduce at year 1 would be really bad because you would lose out. Your genes would be lost from the population almost immediately because look, these guys that delay reproduction till later have at least a 2-to-1 advantage in fitness. You got to remember what that means. A 1% difference in fitness is huge. An organism that has a 1% advantage over another, that trait will go to fixation in less than 100 generations. So these guys that start reproducing at 1 year will be crushed by organisms that start reproducing later. They will be eliminated from the population almost immediately. On the other hand, if you wait until you are 2 years old to start reproducing, then you can double the number of eggs, and you double the number of eggs you can reproduce every year. So you can have 20 here, you can have another 20 here, and so your lifetime reproduction is 40. And so your lifetime reproduction after 8 years would be 140 because you've reproduced for 7 of the 8 years. Okay. But now that assumes that you're not going to get eaten in year 2. If you are, then it's better to reproduce immediately. So you can see that there's a trade-off then between how long you can expect to live and when you should start reproducing. If you can expect to live a long time, then you would be very well advised to save up your energy and reproduce at a later age so that you can reproduce more. This individual here that starts reproducing at age 4 can produce 10, 20, 30, 40 eggs a year compared to 10 eggs a year. So here, this guy is producing 40 eggs here, 40 here, 40 here. And at the end of its life, at age 8, it's produced 200 eggs. So that's way better than starting to reproduce earlier, because anybody who reproduces earlier loses out. This is a 10% difference in fitness. This is a much greater difference in fitness. So if you can live a long time, it pays to delay reproduction. If you can expect to be eaten before you reach year 2, then you better reproduce right away. Okay. So these 3 trade-offs kind of illustrate how these life history traits function to funnel energy into growth, into survival, or into reproduction. Now let's look at a couple of kind of extreme strategies: iteraparity and simulparity. Now, most species that live longer than, say, 1 year, they're iteraparous. They reproduce repeatedly. They reproduce a little bit every single year. Some species, however, are simulparous. They wait, they store up energy, they reproduce once, and then they die. So this is kind of Big Bang reproduction. Now, short-lived species are kind of by definition simulparous. If you're an annual plant, then you're going to reproduce once and you're going to die. That's kind of uninteresting. What's really interesting is organisms that live many years and still save up their energy to reproduce one time. Okay, and some examples of those are agaves, like right here, and bamboos, and salmon. And they store their energy for many years, and they reproduce once, and then they die after that single reproductive event. They just pour everything into their reproduction. So what are the conditions that favor simulparity, this really weird extreme strategy? Well, okay. So one factor is if juvenile survival is inconsistent. Like in a single year, juveniles might survive very poorly. And then once in a great while, you have conditions where most of the juveniles survive. Well, okay, if that's the case, then it would be best for you to save your energy, skip the years in which most of your offspring are going to die, and wait for that really good year. For agaves, the key thing that they're looking at is rainfall. This is a desert plant. Most years in the desert are very bad, and most of their seeds die due to drought. But in the years that have high rainfall, agaves will sell out. They'll put all their energy into reproduction, they'll reproduce massively, and then they'll die, rather than wait for another 30 years for the next good year. A second thing that favors simulparous reproduction is when it's dangerous or difficult for adults, and that's what's going on with salmon. The salmon live in the ocean most of their lives, and they have to swim upstream to fresh water to lay their eggs. So ask yourself, what are the chances that a salmon will be able to make that journey once, return to the ocean, and wait another 7 or 8 years to make that journey again? There's almost zero chance that a salmon would be able to make that journey twice. It's dangerous, and very likely that salmon will not survive to reproduce a second time. Well, okay, if it's not going to survive to reproduce a second time, then if it's successful in making the journey once, the optimal strategy is to put all its energy into reproduction and then just die. The third thing is when predator pressure is very intense. Okay, and If you reproduce massive amounts, then you can swamp your predators and many of your offspring will survive, as opposed to a given year when if you only produce a few offspring, your predators are going to eat them all up. That's what's going on with bamboos. So bamboos reproduce every 80, 100 years, and they reproduce massively in huge areas. And then all the bamboos die. Well, what that does is then kills all the bamboo predators. And then their offspring can successfully survive in massive numbers. So this is a common strategy of plants. Now, final thing for life histories is how we characterize them. Ecologist named Eric Pianka, who's been at the University of Texas for, I don't know, millennia. He's kind of still there. He hasn't died yet. But he was the first one to try to do this, and he characterized life history strategies as kind of, you could view them on two extremes or somewhere in between the two extremes. But his two extremes were organisms that are good competitors. And he called them K-selected because K is the carrying capacity of the environment. And if a population is at carrying capacity, then competition is very intense. But what he asked, what are the traits that make organisms good competitors? And he decided, well, a large body size would make you a good competitor. You could push smaller individuals around. But in order to get a large body, you have to live a long time because you have to grow for a long time. Okay, and that means that compared to your final body size, your growth rate will be slow over a long period of time because you can't get really big really fast. So you're going to live a long time, you're going to grow relatively slowly. In order to do those things, you cannot reproduce early. You have to save up energy to reproduce late in life. On the other hand, once you start reproducing, you're big and you can devote energy to many reproductive events. However, in order to get a large body, what would be a really good way to start out? Well, a small number of very large offspring. So K-selected organisms have small clutches, maybe only one or two, but they make those babies really big. His other extreme were, he called the reproducers, and he called them R-selected. And R is the population growth rate. So these are species that never experience competition. Instead, their fitness is determined by how well they can survive catastrophic events that kill most of the population. Well, in order to do that, you want a lot of offspring because at least a few of them will survive. If you only have a couple of big offspring and 99% of the population dies in a catastrophe, well, very likely all of your offspring died. But if you have 10,000 offspring, then it's very likely that at least a few of them will survive. So what makes it possible for organisms to have lots of reproduction and have many, many offspring? Well, first off, he's positing that these populations experience catastrophes or predation or something. So are you going to wait to survive, to reproduce? Well, you better not, because you might die before you reproduce. So they're going to invest only in small bodies, and they're going to have short lifespans because they need to reproduce quickly. And so they're going to grow fast, reproduce early. They'll have small bodies as a result, short lifespans. They may only reproduce once or maybe a few times, but they're going to have huge numbers of offspring. And those offspring will be tiny, because what determines your fitness in these kinds of population is whether or not any of your offspring survive at all. And the best way to ensure that is to have huge numbers of small offspring, so that at least a few of them survive. So we will use this dichotomy, K selected versus R selected, repeatedly in this class. This is kind of the one we will focus on. It's not the only one, though. A plant ecologist named Grime from England thought about this and said, you know, there's a third strategy in plants because plants can't escape stress. And so they're going to have a mixture of these traits that is not seen in animals. So he was thinking about plants that grow, say, on mine tailings, where you have toxic chemicals and the plant has to invest a lot of energy in detoxifying the soil. So his idea was, well, it doesn't matter whether they're large or small. To be stress tolerant, you're going to have to live a long time because you're devoting a lot of energy not to growth or reproduction, but to detoxification. So, and his thing was detoxification, but he realized, well, these could be water stressed plants in deserts, any kind of plant that experiences stress. So they'll have to grow slowly over a long period of time, and they'll have late reproduction because they're going to have to be devoting a lot of energy to just tolerating the environment. On the other hand, they'll have many reproductive events, but they'll have small clutches because they don't have the energy to invest in lots of offspring. And the thing that differs then is that they won't be able to invest a lot in any one of their offspring. So whereas K-selected organisms have small numbers of large offspring and R-selected organisms have large numbers of small offspring, stress-tolerant plants will have small numbers of small offspring. And they will also use vegetative reproduction more than most other kinds of plants. So this is an illustration that this K-selected, R-selected thing is not the only way to view these strategies. In fact, there are at least two other ways to view these strategies, aside from Grime. They're more complicated. They're not as useful in teaching about ecology, so we're not going to deal with them. The final thing is I want to illustrate how biotic interactions can change your patterns of allocation. And in this case, we're looking at guppies. And the thing about guppies is that they're small fish that are food for large fish. So if you have predators, then guppies are not going to expect to live very long. But if you have no predators, guppies can expect to live longer. They're more likely to have to compete for food. And I think you can predict how their life history traits should change if predators are present versus when they're absent. Now, the only thing that is being selected here is lifespan, because predators eat the fish, and so their lifespans are shorter where predators are present. So in this little study, scientists looked at the life history traits of guppies above and below waterfalls in Trinidad. And I envy them going to Trinidad for a couple of years to do this. But here is the size of a mature male. And I think you can see that in low predation environments, they can expect to live longer and grow larger. And in high predation environments, they can expect to get eaten before they get really big. So what does that do to their reproductive effort? Well, here is a measure of reproductive investment. And if there's low predation, they're not investing as much in their offspring at each interval as they would if there was high predation. Why is that? Because if you can expect to get eaten, you better invest more in reproduction. And here you got the luxury of not being eaten, and you're going to have to compete. So you better invest less to grow bigger. The number of offspring is relatively low when there's a low predation risk, and it's relatively high when there are predators. Well, that makes sense. If you aren't at risk of predation, you're going to be faced with competition mostly. So you should have a small number of large offspring. Here's the weight of each offspring. Small number of large offspring. On the other hand, if predators are picking you off one by one, you better hope that you can produce enough offspring to survive. So it makes sense to produce a large number of small offspring when there are predators around. And this is finally an illustration that is not just the physical environment. It's not just like fire, flood, catastrophe. It's the biotic interactions that you have to deal with that also affect these life history traits. But the bottom line is there are trade-offs in energy utilization. If you invest energy in one thing, you can't invest it in another. And every single trait changes when there's selection on one trait. So you got to remember that when selection acts on one thing, everything else changes in life history traits. And that is the end of our presentation. And I'm gonna stop sharing the screen, and I'm just gonna open it up for questions. If you want to hold questions, let me just say a few words about the exam. So the exam is 100 points. I'm thinking in a 50-minute exam approximately. We're going to have probably 15 multiple choice and 4 responsive questions. Now, those responsive questions may ask you to analyze the novel situation and sort of write your response. It may ask you to repeat something that we've had in lecture, like explain countercurrent heat exchange in the leg of a bird that lives on polar ice, or explain, countercurrent oxygen, gas exchange in the gill of a fish. That's something that we directly had in lecture. On the other hand, I may pose a scenario to you and say, what would you predict in this situation? But they're not going to be long essays because we only have 50 minutes. Okay. And our coverage is going to be thorough. There will be questions on everything we've had, but we're not going to have like multiple choice questions that have 8 responses. We're going to stick with 5 potential responses and not make them so difficult that you spend all your time working on just one question. I think that the vocabulary is going to be rolled into these multiple choice questions. So a multiple choice question on, say, aquatic environments may be something like the habitat at the bottom of a body of water is called A, pelagic, B, benthic, C, anoxic, D, so kind of like that. So if you know your vocabulary, you'll be able to answer that. All right, and at this point, I think I'm going to be able to make it so the people on Moodle will not have to write a response, photograph it, and upload it. I think you're going to be able to respond to the short response questions just by typing in a text box without diagramming anything. Okay, and I will have more about that when I finalize the questions. So with that, I'm open to take questions on anything.
Dr. Howard?
Yeah.
Back to that last slide, did they find that the reproduction for those guppies in the higher predation areas reproduced earlier?
They did reproduce earlier. Yes, this is just a selection of the graphs from the study that have been redrawn to be kind of pretty and interpretable. But yes, their first age of first reproduction dropped significantly when there were predators present. It's exactly what you'd predict.
Dr. Howard, I have a question.
Okay, Haley.
I was just double checking to make sure lab isn't starting until next week, correct?
Lab is next week, and we're going to keep our fingers crossed that people can get back here for the lab. This is something the university is still trying to figure out. They're trying to figure out how many people might be affected by being displaced from a face-to-face lab. Okay. So I've asked everybody in the labs to tell me, because more than the lecture, you guys are good. If you're displaced, you can finish this course in the lecture. We're still a little iffy on how we're going to handle the labs if you are displaced and can't come back in person. And Dr. Schluchter has asked us to poll you guys about how this is going to work. Ecology is kind of more face-to-face than the other labs, and so maybe not all the instructors may have the same concerns about it, and if some of the labs are online anyway, that's not a concern. But dang, ecology is face-to-face and outside and measuring things and collecting data in a group, and it's more of an issue for us than for some other courses.
Okay, thank you. I was just making sure. I have a FEMA appointment at 12:30. I didn't want it to run over if anything had changed.
No, you go and you get whatever you can get from them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Howard, I have a question.
Okay.
I just need some clarification. So I know that in the lecture about adaptation to land animals, the iguana, they have like that thing on their head to not like for the, kind of like the mangroves, because they are in saltwater environment.
Yes.
Can you just give me some more clarification on like the osmosis regulation in mangroves? Because I'm a little bit confused.
Okay, so marine iguanas and mangroves do not have access to fresh water, and yet they still need water. Mm-hmm. So what they do is absorb salt water into their tissues. They don't have a choice. Okay. Mangroves will raise the osmolarity of their root tissues so that there's still an osmotic gradient that pulls water in. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, it also pulls those small ions in. So they then have to use active transport. They have to sequester the salt to remove it from the water that they're absorbing. And they have to then get rid of it out of their plant bodies. So they're actively transporting sodium in these salt glands on their leaf surfaces. That's where most of it's occurring. Marine iguanas also don't have the luxury of drinking fresh water. They have to drink salt water. Mm-hmm. And they have to raise the osmolarity of the fluids in their tissues around the digestive tract in order to get enough water out of their intestines to maintain their bodies. In doing so, they cannot stop from also absorbing those small ions, sodium and chloride. However, they use the same strategy. They have a salt gland, or glands, plural, that in which salt is actively transported out of the body fluids and excreted to the outside. So this is a huge extra cost for them in terms of energy, but it's an adaptation that allows them to live in saline environments that they would not normally be able to live in.
And would that result in the iguanas like excreting diluted urine, or would that be for?
Okay, so this is kind of a little different from the from the way that we talked about the freshwater and marine fish.
Mhm.
Let's walk through what the marine iguana has to accomplish. It has to save water. So it's going to excrete a concentrated urine. It's going to actively transport as much sodium and other solutes into the urine as possible and reabsorb water from the urine by active transport. However, that's enough. That's not enough to maintain their homeostasis. They have to have these extra investments in sodium or salt glands that pull extra salt out. So they're trying to produce a concentrated urine so that they don't lose the water in their bodies. They actively transport sodium into the urine, actively transport water out. But they need the additional salt glands.
Okay.
Okay. And I saw somebody type a question about the number of questions. It's 15, not 50. There aren't, I don't even think there are 50 multiple choice questions on the final. So, Anna Sophia, did you have another comment?
And that's just because the water that they're surrounded by has a lot of salt. So the water wants to suck out all the water from the mangroves and the iguana.
Yes. They are in hypersaline environments. And so the surrounding water is hyperosmotic compared to the bodies of both mangroves and iguanas. And they need to conserve the water inside their bodies. They need to excrete the excess salt that they are forced to absorb.
Okay, and then just one last question. I'm sorry, guys. What would be the environment then for animals to secrete a diluted urine that has limited amount of light?
Okay, so remember that organisms need to maintain a specific osmotic balance. They need a specific ratio of, or specific concentration of sodium, chloride, other ions in their blood to function properly. So in freshwater environments, the water is hypotonic compared to their bodies. That means that there's a gradient, diffusion gradient, that sucks fresh water into the bodies of freshwater organisms. That dilutes them and makes it impossible for them to live. They need to get rid of that extra water that continually diffuses into their blood.
Okay.
And remember, this is a problem especially for freshwater organisms like fish, because they have to expose their gills. They have to expose their blood to the surrounding environment in terms of their gills. So as oxygen diffuses from water into their bloodstream, they're also forced to absorb water molecules. They can't help it. And they need to get rid of that water. So they produce a dilute urine in fresh water.
Okay. And then countercurrent, that is in relation to like body temperature, right? Because
okay, countercurrent flow is a common adaptation that we see in terms of gas exchange in aquatic organisms. It's much more efficient to have countercurrent flow when you're trying to get rid of carbon dioxide and absorb oxygen as an aquatic species. And it also is used in heat conservation in actually many terrestrial organisms, and in endothermic fish. No fish are truly endothermic in the same way that terrestrial organisms are, but they can maintain a higher body temperature than the surrounding water. The only way they can do that is through countercurrent heat exchange.
and that's because they can't maintain a constant body temperature.
Right, the heat capacity of water is so great that most of the metabolic heat that organisms produce in water is just completely lost. aquatic organisms that are big enough and have enough muscle mass can maintain a higher body temperature, but they can't maintain as high a body temperature as terrestrial organisms can.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Mhm. Anybody else before we go? These are all very useful questions, and I'm happy to answer more.
Okay, so I have another I have another question. Um, this is for the global climate. Let me see. Let me pull up
Global
the,
climate system, yeah.
yes, let me just pull it up. I didn't know if anyone else had questions, so I just
Keep asking unless somebody else breaks in.
okay, so I'm sorry, I'm trying to find it. So for the Coriolis force, um, since it's in centripetal motion, the force would it be like parallel to the equator, which is why it, like if it's going towards the east, like we'll feel wind coming from the west, or
Okay, so this is the tricky thing in that presentation. Everybody has trouble visualizing this. So what I try to do is explain that the surface of the Earth rotates at different speeds depending on where you are.
Mhm.
At the equator, it's rotating 1,000 miles an hour. North and south of the equator, it's rotating slower. So the air that flows towards the equator is flowing from an area where there's low rotation speed to an area where there's high rotation speed. That means the air is traveling slower than the land that's rotating under it. Since the land that's rotating under it is rotating from west to east, it feels as though that wind is coming out of the east because the land is rotating faster than the wind that's blowing over it. It's exactly like driving down the freeway and sticking your head out the car window.
okay.
The direction of travel is from west to east. That means you always perceive the wind as coming from the east.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Okay, and from 30 degrees to 60 degrees, it's the opposite situation. The surface of the Earth rotates slower at 60 degrees than it does at 30. So the wind coming from 30 degrees has a faster speed of rotation than the Earth it's moving over. So it appears to come from the opposite direction, from the west.
So
But yeah, that's the hardest thing for anybody in this course to grasp about the global climate system is the Coriolis force.
awesome.
Dr. Howard, I have a question about, let's see, it's one of the ones that we did virtually. The one that we talked about adaptations to life on land. It was the one talking about the C4 photosynthesis.
Okay.
You said that the PEP goes into the bundle sheath, but earlier you said the OAA gets converted from the PEP and the CO2. So is it OAA or PEP that goes into the bundle sheath?
Okay, it would probably be useful for me to pull that up.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's fine. Let's pull it up and
I was so confused on that too, so I'm thankful you
where is it?
brought
Where is
that
it?
up.
Where is it? Okay, well, the crucial thing to understand is that PEP, phosphoenolpyruvate, is, yeah, doggone it, I'm trying to find it on my computer. Hang on. Oh, I got it here.
Show it as slide 16.
Yeah. I have to click through all these screens to find my stuff. All right, so let's share. Let's go ahead and share the screen because I think it will. I think it will help. And I mean, I'm throwing a lot of abbreviations at people in these presentations. That one in particular. So here's your standard C3 photosynthesis. Okay, and you got the Calvin cycle. You got all this machinery, right? And the thing about C4 photosynthesis is that it uses all the same machinery, but it adds something on. Okay, so in C3 photosynthesis, you take ribulose bisphosphate and you add a carbon to it to make 2 molecules of G3P, or glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Okay, and I'm not going to ask you to remember the names of these things. But in C4 photosynthesis, you can save water by adding on these extra reactions. And so in water limited environments, C4 photosynthesis has an advantage. So in C4 photosynthesis, here's where we're starting. We've got a spatial segregation of the reactions in photosynthesis. So the mesophyll cells have a portion of the reactions now that used to occur in a single cell in C3 photosynthesis. And the Calvin cycle is isolated from these other reactions. So what it's doing then is taking phosphoenolpyruvate, PEP, in the mesophyll, and it's adding a carbon to that to make a 4-carbon oxaloacetic acid. Okay, that oxaloacetic acid is converted to malic acid, which is then goes into the bundle sheath cell. And then carbon is split off from malic acid, regenerating pyruvate, which is then transported back into the mesophyll cell to pick up another carbon. The thing is that phosphoenolpyruvate has a higher affinity for CO2 than ribulose bisphosphate. So it binds greater carbon at lower CO2 concentrations. And so it's more efficient. On the other hand, look at all the extra reactions you have to have. You can accumulate lots of CO2 in these bundle sheath cells because they're isolated from the mesophyll cell, which is basically open to the air. But look at all the extra reactions you have to go through to do that. So it's not as efficient. You're spending some of the energy that you would have gained in C3 photosynthesis to convert oxaloacetic acid into malic acid, to transport malic acid into the bundle sheath, and then to regenerate pyruvate and transport it back. So C4 photosynthesis conserves water because you can accumulate huge amounts of carbon in these bundle sheath cells. And then you can run these reactions all night long. But you have to spend some of the energy that you would have gained in all these extra reactions. So it's oxaloacetic acid is the product. PEP is the receiver of CO2 instead of Rubisco. PEP carboxylase is the enzyme that has a higher efficiency than ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase. So this enzyme has a higher efficiency. PEP is the receptor. Oxaloacetic acid is the initial product. Malic acid is the product that gets transported into the bundle sheath to give up its carbon and regenerate pyruvate. Okay, The crucial things here, from my perspective, are the gain in water conservation you get from isolating the Calvin cycle in a separate cell. Because PEP carboxylase is so much more efficient, you can close down your stoma and just live on the CO2 that's inside the cell already, because PEP carboxylase is way more efficient. If you were to try to do that with ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase, it would actually drive the reaction backwards once you got to a low level of CO2. Okay, but that's the advantage of C4 photosynthesis. The disadvantage, of course, is that you make a lot less energy because you're wasting all this energy in these reactions that you don't have in C3 photosynthesis. So my bottom line is the trade-off between energy efficiency in C3 photosynthesis and water conservation in C4 photosynthesis. I'm less worried that you memorize every single one of the reactants and understand that by segregating the light reactions from the dark reactions, you have the ability to lose much less water in dry conditions. So here's kind of the bottom line here. You can open up your stomata for these reactions to go at night. And then you can transfer all the CO2 here into these cells and just wait for daylight to come. When daylight comes, you close the stomata and you use up whatever CO2 you have. But because you've accumulated all this CO2 in the bundle sheath, you can drive this reaction over and over and over again without losing water. So having two sets of cells allows you to conserve water. You can absorb CO2 at night in the mesophyll, transfer it into the bundle sheath. You can wait for light to come during the day, and then you can drive this reaction during the day. Okay. CAM plants don't have the spatial segregation, but they do have the temporal segregation, day-night. Okay, those are the things that I want to focus on. This is not a biochemistry class, and we're not memorizing reactants as much as we might. Yes, I do want you to know that PEP carboxylase has a higher affinity than RUBP carboxylase. And that's the key to C4 photosynthesis.
Thank you very much.
Okay. It's kind of a fine line trying to understand what it is that I really want you to know sometimes, but if you're ever in doubt, please ask, because our bottom line is adaptation here. It's not necessarily the memorizing the biochemical reactants. It's understanding the relative affinities of the enzymes. It's understanding what you get when you go one way versus the other way. Okay. Anybody else have a question before we go? Okay, let me just say that you can email me anytime. You can ask for a Zoom session if that would be helpful, but you can email me a question if all you need is an answer to a question. I will be on again Friday at 9:30 to 11. And hopefully this time I'll get here, I'll remember that my computer is old and it takes a long time to connect, and actually be on at 9:30. But my advice is to look at the study guides and make that the centerpiece of your presentation. Ask yourself, can I write a complete answer that incorporates this bullet point in the study guide? Yes, we do have lecture on Friday. It will not be on the first exam, but we will have a lecture to keep on track. Okay, so if you look at a bullet point on terrestrial adaptation, can you write it out? completely, go back and check yourself with the PowerPoint presentation, and if you need to, the recorded version, because that will tell you whether you kind of got it. And remember that a lot of my questions ask you to analyze something or recall something and then ask why. And that second part of the explanation is just as important as being able to synthesize the facts or to remember the facts from lecture. Okay, don't just read over your notes. That's useless.
So for analyzation, like how would what would be like a good practice for us to do so we practice how to analyze like certain topics? So we
Okay,
know.
so what I have not been able to get done just yet is to post an old exam to give you examples of like questions in which I'm asking you to sort of recall and explain something from lecture or posing a novel situation. And I'm going to do that today. Okay, so you'll be able to see kind of what the philosophy is in asking those kinds of questions.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. All right. More questions? I need to go drink something because my voice is kind of getting scratchy.
Thank you. You have a good day. We'll see you Friday.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then I'm going to end this one. And remember, there's never a penalty for asking me something.
Thank you.
All right, here we go. Bye all.